Picture this. Winter, 1777. The Continental Army is coming apart at the seams. 12,000 men marched into Valley Forge, Pennsylvania just weeks ago. Now they are starving. They are freezing. Hundreds are dying every month. Typhus, dysentery, and the brutal Pennsylvania cold are killing more soldiers than the British ever could. The men who can still stand don't know how to march in formation. They can't reload their muskets with any speed. And the bayonets fixed to the ends of their weapons, they use them to roast meat over the campfire. That is it. That is all they think a bayonet is good for. Meanwhile, the British Army, the most disciplined fighting force on the planet, is camped just 18 miles away in the comfortable city of Philadelphia, sleeping in warm beds, eating hot meals, waiting. George Washington knows the truth. If something does not change, and fast, the American Revolution is over. The dream of independence will die in the snow of Valley Forge before it ever gets a chance to become a country. What nobody knew at the time was that the man who would save this army was already on a ship crossing the Atlantic, and almost everything about him was a lie. Friedrich Wilhelm von Steuben was born on September 17, 1730 in the fortress town of Magdeburg, Prussia. His father was a captain in the Prussian engineering corps. Friedrich grew up surrounded by soldiers, cannons, and the rigid discipline that made the Prussian military the most feared in all of Europe. He was not raised to be a tradesman or a scholar. He was raised to fight. At 14 years old, he watched his father direct military engineers during the siege of Prague. By 17, he had enlisted in the Prussian army as a lance corporal. This was not a man who stumbled into soldiering. He was born into it. When the 7 Years' War erupted in 1756, Steuben was right in the middle of it. He served as an infantry officer, then a staff officer, eventually rising to the rank of captain. He earned an assignment at the headquarters of Frederick the Great himself, the legendary Prussian king whose battlefield genius had made all of Europe nervous. At Frederick's elite academy for young officers, Steuben learned the intricacies of Prussian drill, logistics, and battlefield maneuver at the highest possible level. This was a real education in how to build and run a professional army. The skills were genuine, every single one of them. But the war ended in 1763, and the Prussian military shrank dramatically. Steuben was discharged. He was 33 years old, a former captain, and suddenly unemployed. What followed was more than a decade of frustration. He tried Austria, he tried France, he tried Baden. Nobody wanted a former Prussian captain in peacetime Europe. Armies were contracting, not hiring. He was a warrior with no war to fight, a craftsman with no one willing to pay for his craft. By 1777, Steuben was 47 years old, broke, and running out of options. 3,000 miles across the ocean, a revolution was about to become his last chance. Then, something changed. Steuben traveled to Paris and reconnected with an old acquaintance, Claude Louis, Count of Saint-Germain, France's Minister of War. Saint-Germain saw the potential. He arranged a meeting between Steuben and the two American diplomats in Paris, Benjamin Franklin and Silas Deane. But Franklin had seen too many unemployed European officers walk through that door begging for commissions. He sat through the meeting looking bored, then cut it short and told Steuben they had no job for him. That should have been the end of the story, but the French government had other ideas. Senior figures in the French War Office convinced Franklin and Deane to reconsider, and this is where the deception begins. Franklin and Deane wrote Steuben a letter of recommendation to present to Congress. In that letter, they described him as a lieutenant general in the service of the King of Prussia. That was not true. Steuben had left the Prussian army as a captain, not a general. Historian Thomas Fleming would later call this letter the greatest public deception ever perpetrated in a good cause. Steuben didn't write the lies himself, but he accepted them completely. And once he reached American soil, he added a few flourishes of his own. But here is the detail that changes everything. The deception was not just about vanity, it was strategic. Franklin understood that Congress would ignore a former captain. They needed a name that commanded instant respect. A lieutenant general who had served under Frederick the Great, that was someone worth listening to. And to seal the deal, Steuben offered to serve as an unpaid volunteer. He asked only to be compensated if America won the war. Congress, exhausted by foreign officers demanding paychecks, loved this arrangement. They took the deal. Steuben sailed from France in September of 1777 aboard a frigate called the Flamande. He brought with him 4 French aides to translate, a military secretary named Pierre Duponceau, and his Italian greyhound, a dog named Azor, who went absolutely everywhere with him. When they landed at Portsmouth, New Hampshire in December, they were nearly arrested. Steuben and his entourage were wearing bright red trim on their traveling clothes, and the locals mistook them for British troops. Once the confusion was sorted out, the story of the supposed Prussian lieutenant general spread fast. In Boston, John Hancock hosted a dinner in his honor. Samuel Adams chatted with him about politics and military affairs. Everyone was struck by this large, imposing man with a silver star pinned to his chest, engraved with the word Fidelis. He looked like a general. He spoke like a general. He moved through a room with the quiet confidence of someone who had spent a lifetime around professional soldiers. The lie was working perfectly, not because he was pretending, but because the real man was already everything the letter claimed. On February 23, 1778, Steuben rode into the Continental Army's camp at Valley Forge and reported for duty. George Washington rode out personally to meet him. Picture the scene. Washington on horseback in the Pennsylvania winter, moving through rows of crude log huts where his soldiers huddled under threadbare blankets, many of them without shoes, some wrapped in rags and animal skins just to stay alive. And here comes Steuben, an enormous, imposing figure on a towering horse, gleaming silver star on his chest, the unmistakable bearing of a man who had walked into war rooms his entire life. One Continental soldier later described his first impression as a perfect personification of Mars, the ancient Roman god of war. Washington wrote that the Baron appeared to be much of a gentleman, and as far as he could judge, a man of military knowledge. Cautious, but intrigued. Within 2 weeks, Washington made Steuben acting inspector general and asked him to assess the entire Continental Army. What Steuben found horrified him. Latrines placed randomly, sometimes directly beside the camp kitchens. Dead horses rotting in open areas with no one moving them. No standardized drill. No consistent method for anything. Each regiment did things differently depending on where they came from. Some soldiers didn't even know how to form a proper battle line. And the bayonets. Steuben later wrote that the American soldier had never used this weapon, had no confidence in it, and never used it for anything except to roast his beefsteak. The British won battles by charging with bayonets. The Americans had no answer for it. Every single time those redcoats lowered their blades and charged, the American line broke and ran. Every single time. Here is where the story takes a turn nobody expected, because despite his fabricated rank and his embellished credentials, Friedrich von Steuben actually knew exactly what he was doing. His years of Prussian training, his time on Frederick's staff, his education at the elite officer academy, those things were real. He might not have been a lieutenant general, but he was a superbly trained military professional who understood how to build an army from the ground up. And he got to work immediately. Steuben created what he called a model company. He selected 100 soldiers from various brigades plus 50 men from Washington's personal lifeguard unit. Then he did something that no European general would ever have done. Instead of writing instructions and handing them off to junior officers, Steuben drilled these men himself, personally. Every morning before dawn, he was already on the parade ground in his full dress uniform, medals, polished boots, the silver star, standing in the mud and the cold, waiting for his men. Face to face with privates and corporals, he showed them exactly how to hold a musket, how to stand at attention, how to march at 75 steps per minute. Then, at 120, he walked down the line, adjusting grips, correcting posture, physically repositioning their arms and legs. He taught them how to form lines and columns, how to wheel and change direction without breaking formation, and how to execute a bayonet charge that would terrify any enemy on the receiving end. In the Prussian army, these were basics. In the Continental Army, they might as well have been magic. This was not how generals behaved in the 18th century. Generals gave orders. They did not get their boots dirty training enlisted men. But Steuben had understood something about the American soldier that most European officers would have missed entirely. These men were not fighting for a king. They were not mercenaries fighting for gold. They were citizens fighting for an idea. And they responded to a leader who was willing to work alongside them, not one who barked orders from a comfortable distance. There was one problem: Steuben barely spoke any English. Every night, his secretary Duponceau would translate the day's drills from French into English, with help from two of Washington's aides, Alexander Hamilton and John Lawrence. By morning, the translated instructions were ready, but when things went wrong on the training field, when soldiers fumbled or ignored what they had been shown, Steuben would erupt. He'd curse in German, then in French, then he would spin around to his aide and shout, "My dear Duponceau, come and swear for me in English. These fellows will not do what I bid them." The soldiers loved it. They found it hilarious. And it worked, because Steuben wasn't just teaching drill, he was building something: morale, camaraderie. He was turning a demoralized collection of strangers into a team. Eventually, he picked up enough English to curse on his own, and his booming voice rolling across the frozen training ground with freshly acquired profanity became one of the most recognizable sounds at Valley Forge. Pay attention to this detail, because it explains everything that followed. Steuben didn't just train those 100 men and move on. He trained them to become trainers. Once the model company had mastered the drills, those soldiers went back to their own regiment and taught everyone else. It was a cascade, a chain reaction of competence spreading outward through the entire army. And within 2 months, the transformation was complete. Soldiers who had barely known which end of the musket to point at the enemy were now marching in tight formations, reloading with speed and precision, and executing bayonet charges that would have made a Prussian drill sergeant proud. On May 5th, 1778, Washington organized a full military parade at Valley Forge to celebrate the news that France had officially entered the war as an ally. Washington expected a sloppy, awkward display. Instead, he watched in stunned silence as his troops marched with crisp precision, executing maneuvers that would have looked at home on a Prussian parade ground. The transformation was undeniable. Congress officially appointed Steuben Inspector General with the rank of Major General on May 5th, 1779. The former captain who had arrived with forged credentials now held a real generalship, earned entirely on merit. The ultimate test came in June of 1778 at the Battle of Monmouth in central New Jersey. The day was brutally hot, temperatures near 100 degrees. The initial American advance collapsed when General Charles Lee ordered a sudden and controversial retreat. Washington rode forward in fury, rallied the retreating troops, and ordered them to stand and fight. And they did. For the first time in the war, the Continental Army fought as a unified, disciplined force. They held formation under withering volleys that would have scattered them 6 months earlier. And when the British charged with bayonets, the tactic that had broken the American line in nearly every battle before, the Americans did not break. They did not run. They countercharged. Soldiers who had learned bayonet combat from a Prussian drill master on the frozen fields of Valley Forge used those same skills in the scorching heat of New Jersey. One historian later wrote that in the old days, the Continentals would probably have fled. After Valley Forge, after Steuben, they didn't even consider it. The following year, in July of 1779, the results of Steuben's training became even more dramatic. At the Battle of Stony Point, General Anthony Wayne, known as Mad Anthony for his fearless aggression, led a nighttime assault on a British fortification perched on a rocky promontory along the Hudson River. Wayne's soldiers had been extensively trained in bayonet combat by Steuben in the months following Valley Forge. And in one of the most audacious attacks of the entire war, they stormed the fort with unloaded muskets. You heard that right. They did not fire a single shot. They crossed hundreds of yards of open ground in the dark, waded through water, climbed steep rocks, and overwhelmed the British garrison entirely with bayonets, the same weapon that American soldiers had been using as cooking utensils just 18 months before. A historian later called Stony Point altogether the most brilliant performance of the American Revolution. During the winter of 1778 to 1779, Steuben wrote the book that would cement his legacy. Regulations for the Order and Discipline of the Troops of the United States, known simply as the Blue Book, was the first standardized military manual for the American Army. It covered everything: how to march and set up camp, how to load and fire weapons, how to organize a regiment, how sergeants should train and manage their soldiers. Steuben wrote the original in French. Alexander Hamilton and Nathaniel Greene helped him refine and translate it into English. Congress approved it in March of 1779, and copies were distributed to every company and officer in the Army. The Blue Book remained the official training manual of the United States Army until 1814, more than 35 years after it was written. A fake general had written the real rulebook for the entire United States military. Steuben served through the rest of the war. He was present at Yorktown in 1781, commanding one of 3 divisions during the siege that forced General Cornwallis to surrender. In 1784, he was discharged with honors and became an American citizen by a special act of Congress. The man who had arrived with a forged resume was now officially an American. But the ending of Steuben's story is not the triumphant finale you might expect. Despite his enormous contributions, he spent his final years struggling with money. The financial compensation he had been promised was slow to arrive, and when it did, he burned through it faster than it came. It wasn't until 1790 that Congress finally granted him a pension of $2,500 a year. He moved to a modest estate near the town of Remsen, New York. Far from the glory and noise of the war that had defined him, he never married. He had no children. When he died on November 28, 1794, at the age of 64, he was buried in a grove on his own land, a spot that later became the Steuben Memorial State Historic Site. The man who had once strutted through Valley Forge in full dress uniform died quietly in a simple farmhouse in rural New York. In 1783, George Washington wrote his final letter as American commander to General Steuben, thanking him for his faithful and meritorious service. It was one of the last official acts of the Revolution. Today, his statue stands at Valley Forge. Another stands in Lafayette Park, directly across from the White House in Washington. Communities across the country carry his name. Steuben County in New York, Steuben County in Indiana, the city of Steubenville, Ohio. German Americans celebrate von Steuben Day every September. Parades honoring the man who crossed an ocean to fight for a country that was not his own. And here is what makes this story impossible to forget. Yes, his credentials were fake. His rank was invented. His closeness to Frederick the Great was exaggerated. But the skills were real. The knowledge was real. The transformation he achieved was undeniable, measurable, and proven in battle after battle after battle. He took an army that didn't know how to use a bayonet and turned them into soldiers who could win a fight using nothing else. He wrote the book that defined the American military for a generation. He built the non-commissioned officer system that still echoes in every drill sergeant's voice and every NCO's authority today. Friedrich von Steuben was a liar. He was also the most important military trainer in American history. And the country he helped create never could have won its independence without him. Sometimes, the right man for the job is someone who has to lie just to get the interview.